He told her to be invisible, to stand beside him without touching him, without speaking to him, without letting anyone believe for even 1 second that their marriage was anything more than a transaction written in cold ink. She had followed that rule for 6 years. But tonight, inside a ballroom full of powerful men watching her like she was something new, Serafina Vale stopped following rules. And the most dangerous man in the room couldn't take his eyes off the woman he had ordered to disappear. If you've ever been told you weren't worth noticing, stay with me until the end of this story. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far Serafina's story travels. The dress was the color of deep water, and it fit her like a secret she had kept too long. Serafina Vale stood in front of the mirror in the east wing of the Veretti estate and did not recognize herself. Not because she looked bad, but because she looked like someone who had decided something. That was new. The decision was quiet, the way a fracture is quiet before the wall falls, and she wasn't entirely sure what she had decided. She only knew that when the car arrived in 40 minutes to take them to the Bellavera Foundation Gala, she would not spend the ride rehearsing how to be smaller. She touched the edge of her jaw. There was a bruise there. Not from violence, nothing so obvious. From pressure. She had spent the better part of 3 days with her teeth clamped shut against words she didn't speak, and her jaw had absorbed the cost. She pressed 2 fingers against it and breathed through her nose. 6 years. 6 years inside a house that never warmed, inside a marriage that operated like a contract under glass. Preserved, legally binding, never meant to be touched. Lucian Veretti had been precise about what he wanted from her when they signed the agreement. Her name, her presence at the required events, her silence about the rest. He had been equally precise about what she should not want from him. No companionship, no intimacy, no expectation of anything resembling a life shared between 2 people who chose each other. She had agreed. That was the thing she could never stop coming back to. She had agreed. Serafina picked up her earrings from the dresser. Small, expensive, chosen by a stylist she'd never met, and put them on. The woman in the mirror put them on too, and for one unsteady moment they looked at each other like strangers. She heard him in the hallway before she heard the knock. She recognized his footstep the way you recognize a sound that has never once meant comfort. The particular weight of it, the no hesitation rhythm, boots on marble that had been polished by a staff of 12 who knew better than to be in the wrong place when he passed. The knock came. 2 sharp raps. Serafina. Not a question, not a greeting. Her name spoken like a summons, the way you'd call a dog or check a box. "I'm ready," she said through the door. A pause, then, "The car is 7 minutes out. Come downstairs." Footsteps retreating, already gone. She exhaled through her mouth, slow, put her clutch under her arm, looked at herself one more time. "You're fine," she thought. Then, quieter. "You're done being fine." Lucian Veretti was standing near the foot of the grand staircase when she came down, his back to her, his phone in his hand. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in 4 months, and he wore it the way he wore everything, like it was armor, like the point was not to look beautiful but to look impenetrable. His hair was dark, starting to thread with gray at the temples, and his jaw was set with the permanent tension of a man who had trained himself not to release it. He did not look up when she reached the bottom of the stairs. He said to his phone, "Confirm it before midnight or the arrangement is void." And then he ended the call and turned, and for approximately 2 seconds, his eyes moved across her. The dress, the earrings, the way she was standing, and his expression gave nothing. "You'll sit at table 7, he said. "Aldous Fene will be to your left. His wife had a surgery recently. Do not ask about it. He's sensitive. The gentleman to your right is Marcus Thiel. He oversees foundation funding for the Northeast Corridor. Keep him talking. He likes to feel heard." Serafina nodded. "Anything else?" "Yes." He put the phone inside his jacket. "Ignore me tonight. Do not approach me. Do not initiate contact. If anyone asks about our relationship, you redirect the conversation. You are here as the Veretti name, not as my personal attachment. Is that clear?" She looked at him for a moment. She was used to this. The briefings, the instructions delivered like she was a junior operative being deployed. She had always nodded her way through them, had always performed the exact compliance he wanted, and then disappeared into whatever corner of an event she'd been assigned to. Clear, she said. He studied her face for something. She didn't know what. Then he turned toward the door and the two men in dark suits who were already holding it open. Serafina followed. She did not look at the back of his neck the way she used to, searching for some softening she might have missed. She looked at the door. The Bellavere Foundation Gala was held every year in the ballroom of the Arden Continental Hotel, and it was, by every measure that mattered to the people inside it, one of the most important rooms in the city. The foundation ostensibly raised money for urban renewal initiatives. In practice, it was where the structural power of the city, old money, organized crime, municipal government, and high finance, shook hands in expensive clothes and confirmed that the order of things would continue to hold. Lucian Veretti was at the center of that order. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to be in the center of anything. Men straightened slightly when he approached. Women measured him. The ones who knew him well enough to know what he actually was kept a careful, respectful distance. Close enough to be acknowledged, not so close as to invite scrutiny. Serafina peeled off at the entrance to table 7, found her seat, and introduced herself to Aldous Fene, who was 73 and had a hearing aid he was vain about and kept adjusting when he thought no one was watching. He had sad eyes and the careful mouth of someone who had been practicing composure for a long time. She did not ask about the surgery. She asked about his work in the early years of the foundation, and he lit up the way old men do when they realize you actually want to hear the answer. Marcus Thiel arrived 15 minutes late, apologized to no one, and sat down heavily like the chair had been waiting too long. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the abrupt manner of a man who is always in the middle of a calculation. He ordered a drink before he acknowledged anyone at the table, and then his eyes found Serafina, and he said, "You're Veretti's wife." "Serafina Vale," she said. He seemed to find the distinction amusing. "Right, you're not using his name." "I kept my own." "Smart," he said, and meant it neutrally. And then he started talking about the Northeast Corridor funding challenges, and she listened with her full attention because she had always been good at listening and because tonight, for a reason she could not entirely name, she felt present in a way she hadn't in years. Not performing presence, actually here. She asked Thiel questions, substantive ones, not softballs. She had read extensively about municipal foundation financing, not because she had to, but because she'd had 6 years of long evenings with nothing to fill them except the book she ordered to a P.O. box. Because Lucian had never once asked what she was interested in, and she had stopped leaving that kind of evidence of herself in rooms where it wouldn't be acknowledged. Thiel noticed she wasn't asking to be polite. He turned more fully toward her. Aldous Fene leaned back in his chair slightly and watched the two of them with faint, warm amusement, like a man remembering something good. At some point, she didn't check the time, she laughed. Not the managed social laugh she had learned to produce on command. The appropriate ha, the smile as punctuation. This was a real laugh, caught off guard, because Thiel had made a genuinely dry observation about a city councilman who was across the room making exactly the kind of speech Thiel had just predicted he would make. The laugh came out of her before she could decide whether it was permitted. She didn't look toward Lucian's side of the room. She didn't need to. He noticed it from 40 feet away. Lucian was in conversation with two men whose names he had known for 15 years and whose agendas he had mapped with the precision of someone who understood that survival required you to always know more than the person across from you. He was tracking both conversations simultaneously, which he had always been able to do. A useful skill, one of many he'd developed early and sharpened against necessity. And then, from somewhere near table 7, he heard a laugh. He knew her voice. Of course he knew her voice. He had lived in the same house with it for 6 years. He heard it at the occasional function, cool and controlled, performing whatever the evening required. He knew its managed register, its careful pitch. He did not know that sound. His eyes moved across the room, automatic, fast, and found her. She was turned toward the man to her right, Marcus Thiel, and she was speaking with her hands slightly, which she never did, and Thiel was leaning toward her with the undivided focus of a man who had forgotten there were other people at the table. Old Aldous Fene beside her was smiling at something she'd just said. Lucian returned his attention to the men in front of him. "The Southeastern acquisition is contingent on the zoning variance," one of them was saying, "and the variance requires—" He nodded at the right moment, said the right three words. They continued. He looked at table 7 again. She was gesturing at something. Not dramatically, not performatively, just the natural movement of someone who was entirely inside a conversation rather than hovering at the edge of it. Her posture was different from what he was used to. At home, she held herself with the particular compression of someone who has learned that taking up space has costs. Here, tonight, she was sitting like someone who had remembered she was allowed to occupy the chair. He pulled his attention back. He was irritated. He didn't examine why. The evening moved through its phases: cocktail hour, formal dinner, the Foundation's presentation with its careful slides and carefully rehearsed sincerity. Lucian gave a brief address that he'd refined over the past week with a speechwriter who cost as much per hour as most people made per day, and he delivered it with the flat, controlled authority that the room expected from him. And then he was back among the crowd, working the room with the quiet efficiency of a man conducting business in the margins. He crossed paths with Serafina once, in the corridor near the east entrance where the catering staff moved in and out. She was coming from the restroom. He was heading toward a conversation that couldn't be held inside the ballroom. They stopped. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. That was unusual. After 6 years, he understood her face, or he had believed he did. The slight guardedness, the readiness to adjust, the checking of his mood before committing to her own expression. He knew all of that. He had benefited from all of that. This was something else. She was looking at him the way you look at something you're still deciding about. "The evening's going well," she said. "Yes. Marcus Thiel asked for my contact information. He wants to discuss a secondary funding model I mentioned." Lucian looked at her. "What model?" She told him. Briefly, concisely, with the ease of someone who had thought the thing through. It was not a bad idea. It was in fact a sophisticated read on a problem the Foundation had been circling for 2 grant cycles. He recognized that without wanting to. "Forward him to our legal office," he said. "I'll handle the initial correspondence myself," she said. "I have background in this area." He almost said since when, but something stopped him, some awareness that the question would reveal more than he wanted it to, that it would say, "I have lived beside you for 6 years, and I do not know what you know." "Fine," he said instead. She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked back into the ballroom, and he stood in the corridor and listened to the sound of her heels on the marble until they disappeared into the noise of the room. The car ride home was silent, as it always was. They sat on opposite sides of the back seat, the city moving past the tinted windows in amber and dark, and Lucian watched the buildings and thought about nothing, or tried to. His default state after a long evening was a kind of productive emptiness, cataloging the night, filing the information, letting the social surface shed away so the actual data could be sorted. Tonight the sorting kept getting interrupted. Serafina sat with her clutch in her lap and her face turned toward the window, and she wasn't performing anything. She wasn't waiting for him to speak. She wasn't arranging her posture to signal availability or compliance or any of the things he had grown so accustomed to receiving from her that he had stopped noticing them. The way you stop noticing the hum of a machine that's always running. The machine seemed to have shifted into something else. He didn't have a word for it. He found that he did not like not having a word for it. The car pulled up to the estate. The doors opened. She was out before he was, which was also new. She usually waited, not out of deference exactly, but out of the habit of letting him lead. She walked toward the entrance, and one of the staff held the door, and she thanked him by name. "Thank you, Dario," and went inside. Lucian followed. By the time he reached the upper corridor, her door was already closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. The house was quiet the way houses are when they are very large and very empty. He had chosen that quiet deliberately. He had designed his life around it. He went to his study and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the dark surface of the grounds below. And he thought about the way Marcus Thiel had leaned toward her, and the sound of that laugh crossing the ballroom, and the moment in the corridor when she had said, "I'll handle it myself," without asking whether that was permitted. He told himself the feeling in his chest was operational, a disruption to the expected pattern, something to monitor. He finished the bourbon. He poured another. Serafina did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her room, not theirs. They had never had a theirs. And she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about Marcus Thiel's genuine interest, and Aldous Fenney's tired warmth, and the way she had felt at that table. Solid. Present. Like someone who had a name that belonged to her, and a mind that had things in it worth saying. She thought about the corridor, about the moment she'd told Lucian she'd handle the correspondence herself, and had watched something flicker behind his eyes. Not anger. Something less comfortable than anger. Something he hadn't finished computing by the time she'd walked away. She thought about how 6 years ago she had stood in a lawyer's office and signed her name next to his, and told herself it was practical. It was an alliance between families. She wasn't the first woman to do this and wouldn't be the last. And the things she was giving up, the ordinary hope of being known by someone, being wanted by someone, building something with someone that was hers because both of them chose it, were things she could live without. She was 34 years old, and she had been living without them. The ceiling gave her nothing. At some point, she got up and went to the window and looked out at the grounds, the manicured dark, the security lights throwing hard, pale shadows across the lawn. This was her life. This beautiful, controlled, expensive, empty life. She had 6 figures in an account Lucian funded without discussion, a wardrobe she hadn't chosen, and a face she had learned to make go smooth when she needed it to. And tonight, for approximately 4 hours, she had been someone she recognized. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She needed to think about what that meant, about what she was willing to do about it, about how much longer she could sustain the version of herself that fit inside this house. She didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in 6 years she was asking the questions. And downstairs, in a study full of bourbon and silence, a man who had controlled every variable of his life for 3 decades was sitting in a chair and feeling, without knowing what to call it, the first tremor of something he had believed himself immune to. He would not admit that yet. He wouldn't admit it until the thing he refused to name walked out the door entirely. But the night had already started. The clock was already moving. And Seraphina Vale, in the dark at her window, had already decided, though she didn't yet know the shape of the decision, that she was done being the woman he had ordered to disappear. The morning after this gala arrived gray and without ceremony, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself so much as simply appear. Light pushing through the curtains like it had somewhere else to be, birds doing their indifferent work in the hedges outside, the estate's mechanical systems clicking on in sequence, heat registers, security rotation, the kitchen staff beginning their routines in the floors below. Seraphina was already awake. She had slept maybe 2 hours, shallow and interrupted, the kind of sleep that leaves you more tired than rested because your body tried and failed, and now it knows. She was sitting at the small writing desk in the corner of her room in yesterday's slip, hair loose, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She was not reading. She was not thinking, exactly. She was doing something closer to listening, to the house, to herself, to the particular quality of the silence between those two things. She heard Lucian's door open at 6:43. She heard him move down the corridor toward the east stairs, the ones that bypassed her wing entirely, headed for the private gym on the ground floor that he used every morning with the commitment of a man who understood that physical discipline was the architecture that held everything else together. She heard his footsteps until she couldn't. She put the cold tea down. She pulled out the notebook she kept in the lower left drawer of the desk. Small, cloth-covered, the kind you could buy at any bookstore, which was how she'd bought it, cash, from a store 3 neighborhoods away, which told her something about the state she'd been living in that she hadn't fully let herself examine. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote, "What do I actually want?" She looked at that for a long time. Then she wrote, "To matter to someone, to choose something, to not apologize for existing in a room." She closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, went to shower, and stood under the water until it ran cold, and did not rush. She called Adrian Holloway at 8:15 from her personal cell, the secondary line she paid for herself, and he picked up on the third ring with the easy, unhurried tone of someone who had structured his life to not be on fire at 8 in the morning. Sarah. Just her name, warm, unguarded. She had forgotten what her name sounded like when it wasn't a directive. "I need coffee," she said, "somewhere that's not here." A short pause. "How's Wednesday?" "Wednesday works. Marchetti's, on Cleve. You remember it?" She did. She and Adrian had gone there once, maybe 15 years ago, when they were both still the people they'd been before everything calcified into its current shapes. Small place, loud espresso machine, mismatched chairs, the smell of almond in the walls. "I remember it," she said. 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and felt something she had not felt in a long time. The very specific lightness of having made a plan that was entirely her own. No staff to coordinate, no stylist to notify, no secondary agenda to serve, just a time and a place and a person who knew her before she became a category. She put the phone in her bag and went downstairs to breakfast. So, Lucian was already at the table when she arrived, which was unusual. Normally he took breakfast in his study, standing between calls. Today he was seated, jacket off, the financial pages open in front of him, a cup of black coffee at his right hand. He looked up when she entered and looked back down. She sat at her end of the table. The breakfast staff moved in their practiced silence, plates arriving without being requested, the precise mechanical care of a household that ran on Lucian's preferences. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. This was not unusual. Silence at the Veretti table was the default register. What was unusual was what lived inside the silence this morning, something with more pressure than usual, something that the previous night had loaded into the air between them and that neither of them had discharged. Without looking up from the page, Lucian said, "Thiel's office called this morning." She looked at him. "About?" "The funding model. He wants a meeting next week. Asked that you be present." She reached for her coffee. "All right. I told them to confirm with my scheduler." "I would have preferred to confirm directly." He looked up then. His face was even, but there was something behind the evenness. Not anger, not quite. Something that was deciding what to become. "This is a Veretti Foundation matter. The conversation was initiated by me," she said. "On my own terms, with my own thinking. I'll handle the follow-up." The muscle in his jaw moved. Just once. "You'll coordinate with legal first. I'll coordinate when I have something to coordinate." She set her cup down, exactly as evenly as he would have. "It's a preliminary meeting. I'm capable of attending a meeting." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She did not look away. This was new too. Not the meeting of eyes, but the refusal to be the one who broke it. He went back to the page. "Fine," he said. She ate her breakfast. The food tasted like something. Then Wednesday came and she drove herself, which she almost never did, taking the secondary car from the estate's garage, while the regular driver was occupied in enjoying the particular, uncomplicated pleasure of city traffic. Stop signs, the radio playing a station she chose, her hands on the wheel doing something purposeful. She parked 2 blocks from Marchetti's and walked. The October air had a serious edge to it now, the kind that meant something, and she let it hit her face without pulling her coat closed. And she felt, for those 2 blocks, like a person in her own life. Adrian was already there, at a corner table, the kind of man who is always exactly where he says he'll be. He stood when she came through the door, which still surprised her. She had lived for 6 years in a house where no one stood when she entered a room. And they embraced briefly. The particular embrace of 2 people with long shared history who are being careful about the present. He looked good. He had always been a little ragged around the edges in a way that read as honesty. Dark eyes that paid real attention, a mouth that went straight when he was thinking hard, the kind of lean that came from a body that was used constantly rather than maintained decoratively. He was 41 now. He looked 41. She appreciated that. "You look different," he said as they sat. "Good different or concerning different?" "Awake," he said. "Like something woke you up." She laughed. A small one, but real. That's one way to put it. The espresso machine across the room produced its furious sound, and the barista apologized to no one, and they ordered, and for a while they talked about nothing important, his architecture practice, a project he'd finally gotten funded after 3 years of trying, the mutual friend from their early 20s who had apparently moved to Portugal and was growing something. Regular life. The kind of conversation that reminded her that regular life was still in operation somewhere, that people were still doing ordinary things and calling them by their right names. At some point the conversation shifted. It did it the way those conversations do, not with the announcement, just a tone change, the air becoming slightly more honest. "How are you, Sarah?" he said. "Not the version you tell people." She looked at her cup. I don't know how to answer that yet. That's an answer. She stopped. Started again. I've been inside something for so long, I'm not sure I can see the shape of it anymore. I went to a gala last week and I sat at a table and I talked to people, and it was just. She stopped again. The word felt fragile. It was just me talking, not performing anything, just talking. And I haven't felt like that in 6 years, and I cannot tell you how that felt without crying in a coffee shop, which I'm not going to do. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, what does he say when you try to talk to him? She looked up. We don't talk. At all? We communicate, she said carefully. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. His eyes stayed on her face with the patient, uncomplicated attention of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was worth paying attention to. She had forgotten how much that felt like water when you hadn't known you were thirsty. What are you going to do? He said. I don't know yet. She paused. But I think I'm starting to admit that something has to happen, that I cannot just continue at the same velocity forever and call it a life. He didn't push further. That was one of the things about Adrian. He understood the value of letting a person arrive at the edge of something in their own time. He didn't drag you there, and he didn't pull you back. They stayed for almost 2 hours. When she left, she felt lighter than she had in a long time, and she was also aware, somewhere in the back of her chest, that the lightness was dangerous. Not because Adrian was dangerous, but because the lightness made the weight of home impossible to ignore. Lucian found out the way he found most things he wasn't supposed to know. Not through surveillance in any dramatic sense, but through the unremarkable fact of being someone whose staff were precise and whose network was wide. He was not tracking her. But when he mentioned in passing to the estate's head of security that Serafina had taken the secondary car Wednesday, he received in return the unremarkable information that she had parked near Cleve Street and returned 3 hours later. He sat with that information for 48 hours and said nothing. He did not say anything because he knew that whatever he said would come from a place he hadn't fully identified yet, and Lucien Veretti did not speak from unidentified places. He waited. He watched. He filed. He also noticed, in those same 48 hours, that she moved through the house differently. She came down to dinner, which she often skipped, and she sat at the table and ate, and when he spoke to her, she responded with the directness she'd been developing, the version of her that looked at him and waited for him to say something worth responding to. She smiled at Dario when the man refilled her water. She had a call in the library Wednesday evening that she took with the door not quite fully closed, and through the hallway he could hear the low rhythm of conversation without the words, a woman talking to someone she was comfortable with, the register of ease he hadn't heard from her in years. He told himself it was nothing. On Thursday, he told himself it was nothing again, with more effort. On Friday, he called in Carver, his head of security, 20 years in the post, face like a closed book, and told him to find out who Adrian Holloway was. Carver came back in 6 hours with a file. Lucian read it at his desk, jacket on despite being alone, the way he did everything. Prepared, contained. Adrian Holloway, 41. Principal architect at Holloway Design Partners, founded 11 years ago, mid-sized firm with a good track record in civic projects. Born and raised in the same neighborhood as Serafina. Mutual connections documented as far back as secondary school. No criminal history, no financial red flags, no known connection to any opposing family or organization. He was, by every measurable standard, nobody. Lucian read the file twice. Then he set it down and poured a drink he didn't touch, and stood at the window of his study and looked out at the grounds, and felt something that he refused to name but that sat in his sternum like a stone that hadn't been there a week ago. The man was nobody. And she had spent 3 hours with him on Wednesday morning and laughed with the door not fully closed and moved through the house like someone who had found a reason. Lucian picked up the drink, put it back down without tasting it. He went to find her. She was in the library, which had technically always been available to her, but which she had rarely used, one of the many rooms in the house that existed primarily as architecture rather than life. She had a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, and she had pulled one of the lamps closer in the way you do when a space finally feels like yours. And when he came through the door, she looked up without the old reflex of adjustment, that brief flash of reconfiguring her expression for him. She just looked at him, waited. He closed the door behind him. Who is Adrian Holloway? Not a question. The flatness of a statement that expects an answer. She held his gaze. Something moved across her face. Not fear. Calculation. She was deciding how to do this. He watched her decide and recognized it because he did the same thing and had never expected to see it return to him. He's a friend, she said. From before. Before I married you. He came further into the room. Not close. He stopped near the center, near the reading table with its arrangement of objects she had not chosen. You didn't mention him. You've never asked about my life. 4 words that sat between them like something physical. He felt them. He didn't show it. You're meeting with men you don't mention to me, he said. I'm having coffee with a friend. Her voice was level, not sharp, more dangerous than sharp. Something I'm apparently required to explain to you despite the fact that you have never, not once, told me where you go, who you see, or what you do in the 18 hours a day you're not in this house. That's different. How? Not rising to him, not combative, just the word, straight, waiting for him to hold its weight. He didn't answer immediately, and she watched him not answer, and the not answering was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. I need to know who is in proximity to this household, he said finally. It's a security matter. Don't do that. Her voice dropped a register. Don't make it about security. I know what security looks like, and it doesn't look like this. What does it look like? Like you noticed something, she said quietly, and you don't know what to do with it. The silence that followed was the longest of their marriage. He stood in the middle of her library, and she sat in the chair she had pulled close to the lamp, and neither of them moved. And outside the window, the city carried on with its indifferent noise, and the house breathed around them with all its expensive emptiness. This doesn't need to become a problem, he said. It already is one, she said. The problem is that you're only seeing it now. He left without responding. She listened to his footsteps down the corridor and did not pick up her book and sat in the lamplight with her hands still in her lap and understood, with a certainty that arrived quietly and without drama, that they had just passed through something they could not pass back through. The conversation had confirmed what she'd been moving toward for weeks, that he noticed her absence the same way you notice a draft. Not the window, not the cold, just the wrong temperature, the wrong air, something missing from a room you thought you'd already counted. She thought about what she wanted to write in the notebook. She thought about Adrian's question, what are you going to do? She thought about the marriage agreement, which she had read in full exactly once, 6 years ago, in a lawyer's office, and had not looked at since because she had not needed to, and also because she had been afraid of what it would feel like to hold the terms of your own life in your hands and see how small they were. She got up from the chair. She went to the small locked box in the back of her closet where she kept documents that were hers, her original passport, a copy of her financial records from before the marriage, several letters she had written and never sent to people she had loved and let go of, and one sealed envelope that the lawyer had told her to keep for herself, the counterpart to the agreement, the copy that was hers. She took out the envelope. She did not open it yet. She held it in both hands and felt its weight and let the weight say what it had always said, which was, this was always going to come to this. Then she put it on the desk in the clear center of the lamplight, and she went to the window and she opened the envelope at 2 in the morning. Not because she had planned to. She had stood at the window for a long time, watching the security lights throw their pale geometry across the grounds. And then she had turned around, and the envelope was there on the desk in the lamplight, and the hour had gotten late enough that the pretense of waiting felt absurd. She sat down. She slid her finger under the seal. She pulled out the papers. The marriage agreement was 14 pages, dense with the specific language of people who trusted nothing to interpretation. She had read it once before, 6 years ago, in a state of controlled numbness that had allowed her to move through the words without fully absorbing them, the way you can read a page and reach the bottom and realize you have no idea what it said. Tonight she read it differently, slowly, with the particular attention of someone who was no longer in the business of protecting herself from what she might find. She got to page 9 before she stopped. She read the clause twice, then a third time, the way you read something that your brain resists processing because the processing has consequences. The clause was under the section titled Dissolution Conditions, and it was written in clean, unambiguous legal language. And what it said was this: in the event that Serafina Vale initiated dissolution of the marriage agreement prior to the 7th anniversary of the signing date, all assets acquired or held in joint capacity, including the secondary residence on Alton Court that had belonged to her mother, transferred into the joint holding at the time of marriage as a condition of the original family alliance, would revert to the Veretti estate, her mother's house. She set the papers down, picked them up, set them down again. Her mother's house on Alton Court, the narrow 3-story with the blue door and the garden her mother had kept with the obsessive love of someone who grew things because it was the one thing in her life that answered back. The house Serafina had grown up in, where every room had a specific smell and a specific quality of light that she could reconstruct from memory without effort. That house had been part of the alliance terms. Her mother had been ill. The family had needed protection. The transfer had been described to her as a technicality, a formality, a temporary legal arrangement to satisfy the alliance structure. She had been told it would be reversed once things stabilized. She was looking at a document that said otherwise. She sat for a long time without moving. The lamp buzzed slightly. Somewhere deep in the house, a pipe ticked. Outside, the security light at the northeast corner rotated through its cycle. She had 1 year and 43 days until the 7th anniversary. If she left before then, her mother's house was gone. She did not sleep. By 5 in the morning, she had the agreement laid out across the desk in sections, weighted down at the corners with the small objects from the windowsill. A glass paperweight, a ceramic box, a river stone she had carried in her coat pocket for 3 years because she had found it the day her mother was discharged from the hospital, and it had felt like something she should keep. And she had gone through every page with a pen in her hand that she didn't use, because marking the document felt like surrendering to it, like accepting its authority over her. She needed a lawyer. Not the Veretti legal office, which billed to Lucian and reported to Lucian and had drawn up this document in the first place. Her own lawyer. Someone outside the structure entirely. She wrote a name in the notebook, crossed it out, wrote another. This one was from before. A woman she had known professionally in her previous life, her real life, the abbreviated career she had given up as part of the same arrangement that had taken the house, because one of the tacit conditions of being Lucian Veretti's wife was that you did not have a professional identity that complicated his. Helena Marsh. Tax and estate law. Last known address. The Croft Building on Severn Street. Serafina wrote the name again, cleanly, and closed the notebook. She went to the window and watched the grounds shift from black to gray to the thin particular blue of early morning, and she felt something that she recognized eventually as a specific kind of anger. Not hot, not impulsive, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't dissipate, the kind that becomes structural, that rearranges the supports inside you, that makes you into someone slightly different from who you were before it arrived. She thought about the moment 6 years ago when the lawyer had described the Alton Court transfer as a formality. She thought about Lucian sitting across the table that day, jacket button, pen already in hand, watching her read without reading, watching her sign because she had been 28, and her mother had been ill, and the Veretti name had been described to her as a wall, something that would keep the world from getting in where it could do damage. She thought about whether he had known, whether he had sat at that table and watched her sign a document that he knew contained a trap he hadn't told her about. She didn't know the answer. She needed to know the answer before she did anything else, because the answer changed everything. Changed what kind of fight this was, changed what kind of man she was dealing with, changed, most fundamentally, what she was willing to do about it. She waited until 8 o'clock and then she went to his study. He was there, already working, or performing work. She couldn't always tell the difference. And this morning she was looking at him differently than she ever had, with the flat assessing attention of someone who has just discovered that the room they've been living in has a false wall. He looked up when she came in. He did not invite her to sit. She sat anyway. On the chair across from his desk, straight-backed, the envelope in her hand. She put it on the desk between them. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, which told her something. Page 9, she said. The Alton Court clause. A pause. Short. Calibrated. What about it? I want you to explain it to me. It's standard language for asset protection in a joint holding structure. It was explained at signing. It was not explained at signing. He met her eyes. You had legal representation. I had the lawyer your family provided. She kept her voice exactly level, the way she had learned to keep things level in this house. The control she had developed as a survival mechanism, and that was now, for the first time, serving her rather than him. Who had a billing relationship with the Veretti estate? Who drew up the document? Who had a material interest in me signing quickly and without complication? Lucian leaned back slightly in his chair. It was a small movement, and she tracked it the way she'd learned to track all his small movements, the millimeter adjustments that were the closest he came to expression. Serafina, did you know it was in there? The question sat in the air. He didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was its own answer, and she felt the cold anger rearrange another support beam inside her. The agreement was negotiated between the families, he said finally. Certain conditions were established before I was directly involved. That is not what I asked. The conditions were necessary to establish the alliance structure. Did you know? Her voice, still level, but stripped now of everything except the question. No courtesy remaining, no management, just the words. He held her gaze. Yes. One word. She had been bracing for it, and it still hit her somewhere behind the sternum, someplace that hadn't fully armored yet. She breathed through it. Her hands were still in her lap. She did not let them move. You watched me sign a document, she said, that contained a clause designed to make it prohibitively costly for me to leave, and you said nothing. It was a standard protective measure. In the event of dissolution, assets needed to stop. She said it quietly. Don't use the language of the document on me right now. Just talk to me like a person talking to another person. He stopped. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for. He looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been caught not at a crime, but at something smaller, and in some ways worse. An ordinary, human-scale calculation made 6 years ago and never revisited, never accounted for, because the person it affected had been for 6 years successfully contained. I was protecting the estate's interests, he said. Not an apology. Not quite a justification. Something in between that satisfied neither function. You were protecting yourself, she said, from a woman you'd decided was a liability who might one day want to leave. He didn't deny it. She gave him credit for that, the small, bitter credit of a person cataloging what is and isn't true about someone they've lived alongside for 6 years. She stood up, took the envelope back from the desk. I need you to know something, she said, not as a threat, as information. She pulled in a breath. I am going to speak with an independent attorney about my legal options. Whatever I find, I will proceed accordingly. I am telling you this because I am done doing things in this house that I don't acknowledge out loud. He was on his feet before she reached the door, not grabbing, not blocking, just standing, the motion of a man whose instinct was always to be between a situation and its exit. The anniversary is 14 months out, he said. If you pursue dissolution before then, I know what happens. She turned to face him from the doorway. I know exactly what happens. That's why I'm talking to a lawyer. She left. Her heels on the marble, the distance between his study and the east stairs. She counted the steps without meaning to, the way you count things when the alternative is coming apart. Helena Marsh's office was on the 12th floor of the Croft building, a room that smelled like paper and serious attention, the kind of space that had been used for a long time by someone who was good at what they did and knew it without needing to decorate around it. Helena herself was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head and a habit of very still listening that made you feel, when you spoke, that every word was landing somewhere it would be kept. Serafina arrived at 11, unannounced. The assistant at the front desk started to explain the appointment process, and Serafina said, very quietly, Please tell her it's Serafina Vale. She'll know who I am. She did. Serafina was shown in within 4 minutes. She laid out the situation methodically, the way she had rehearsed it on the drive over, the original agreement, the Alton court transfer, the dissolution clause, the timeline, the representation structure at signing. She spoke for 9 minutes without interruption. When she finished, she put the envelope on Helena's desk. Helena read. The room was very quiet. A printer somewhere in the outer office produced a short mechanical sound and stopped. All right, Helena said, when she had read page 9 twice. She looked up over her glasses. I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Yes. Did your counsel at the time, the lawyer provided by the Veretti estate, did they review this clause explicitly with you before signing, walk you through its specific implications? No? Did they give you adequate time to review independently? I was given the document the morning of the signing. I had approximately 2 hours with it in the presence of the Veretti family's legal team. Helena's face didn't change, but something behind it did. She took the glasses off her head and set them on the desk. That's a potential basis for a challenge under inadequate representation, she said. There are also questions about conflict of interest that may be worth exploring. I'm not going to tell you this is a straightforward case because it isn't. The Veretti legal resources are substantial and they will not roll over. But I'm also not going to tell you this clause is unassailable because it may not be. Serafina released a breath she had been holding since approximately 2 in the morning. What do I do? She said. You give me 2 weeks to research the documentation trail. You do not initiate any conversation with Lucian Veretti about dissolution. You do not sign anything, discuss anything, or make any financial moves without calling me first. Helena looked at her steadily. And you are careful. I'm always careful. Be more careful than that, Helena said. Men like Lucian Veretti don't lose things. They're not practiced at it. When they feel something slipping, they don't always respond predictably. Serafina nodded, gathered the envelope, stood to leave. One more thing, Helena said. The house on Alton Court. Is it currently occupied? My mother's estate manager maintains it. She passed 2 years ago. The words landed the way they always did. A small, clean impact she'd learned to absorb without reaction in public. I've been keeping it. Does anyone else have access? Not that I'm aware of. Get your own lock on it, Helena said quietly. Not through the estate, through yourself. She drove back through the city in the thick of the afternoon traffic, which she didn't mind, which she welcomed actually, the stopping and starting, the ordinary density of people moving around each other with their ordinary purposes. She needed the time between Helena's office and the estate gates. She needed the transition. She was halfway across the Renner Bridge when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something, some instinct, the new one she was developing, the one that paid attention, made her pick up. Mrs. Veretti, a man's voice, flat, professional, without warmth. This is a courtesy call. Who is this? Someone who has been watching your husband's business activities for approximately 3 years. A pause, measured, like a man who had rehearsed this call and was proceeding on schedule. We need to speak with you about the nature of the Veretti holdings. There are matters that affect you directly, matters that go beyond your marriage agreement. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Around her, traffic moved, oblivious. I don't know who you are, she said. Federal Task Force, the man said. Financial Crimes Division. Your husband is under active investigation, Mrs. Veretti. The investigation has reached a stage where certain individuals in proximity to the estate may find themselves categorized as... Another pause, deliberate, letting the silence carry the weight, materially connected to the activity under review. The bridge cables rose on either side of her, massive and indifferent. What does that mean? She said. It means that the attorney you visited this morning, yes, we know about that. This is not surveillance. This is the natural result of watching a situation develop. It means that the steps you're beginning to take are ones we would encourage you to continue. The voice was careful, neither threatening nor reassuring, the voice of someone reading from a script of pure information. But we would encourage you to understand the full picture before you take them, because the full picture is considerably larger than a marriage agreement and a house on Alton Court. She pulled off the bridge at the first exit, sat in a parking bay with the engine running and the city noise coming through the ventilation, and her heart going at a rate she noted with some detachment, because the alternative was panic, and panic was not useful. What do you want from me? She said. 30 minutes, the man said. A conversation. You're not in legal jeopardy from this call or from that meeting. I can provide documentation to confirm the official nature of this contact. We are not asking for anything that puts you at risk. She stared at the concrete barrier in front of the car. She thought about the clause on page 9. She thought about Lucian's one-word answer, yes. delivered without apology in a room full of things that had been chosen for their solidity. She thought about her mother's house with the blue door, sitting on Alton Court with a lock that currently answered to the Veretti estate. She thought about Helena Marsh saying, "The full picture." "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. The Fenner Building on Cascade, 3rd floor, room 309. "I'll be there," she said. She ended the call. Outside the car, a delivery truck rumbled past, and a child on the sidewalk pointed at something Serafina couldn't see and laughed, and the city continued in its enormous indifference, and Serafina sat with both hands on the wheel and understood that she had just stepped across a threshold she had not been able to see until she was already past it, and that on the other side of it, the problem was no longer her marriage, was no longer the clause on page 9, was no longer even the house with the blue door. The problem was now something much larger, something that had been building for 3 years in rooms she had never entered, and that had apparently, at some point, begun to build around her too. She put the car in drive. She needed to think. She needed to be somewhere that wasn't the estate, wasn't Helena's office, wasn't anywhere that Lucian Veretti's resources could reach her in the next 12 hours while she figured out what she was walking into, and whether, now that she had answered the phone on the Renner Bridge, she had any choice left but to walk all the way through. She didn't go back to the estate that night. She drove until the city thinned, and then she found a hotel. Not a good one, not the kind that would recognize her name or report her presence to anyone in the Veretti network. Just a clean, anonymous place off the Meridian interchange with a parking structure and a lobby that smelled like industrial carpet and nobody who cared what she was doing there. She paid cash. She had cash because 6 months ago, without knowing exactly why, she had started keeping $300 in the inside pocket of every coat she owned, which told her that some part of her had been planning this longer than she'd admitted. The room was small and too warm, and the mattress was mediocre, and she sat on the edge of it with her shoes still on and her phone in her hand and felt, for the first time in days, something approaching clarity. Not peace. Clarity is not peace. Clarity is just being able to see the shape of the problem without the fog of everything you don't want to know. She called Adrian at 9:43. He picked up fast, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant something had already reached him. "Sarah." His voice was different, compressed. "What happened?" she said. A breath. "2 men came to my office this afternoon. They said they were doing a background check related to a foundation matter. They asked about you, how we knew each other, how often we'd been in contact recently." She closed her eyes. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That we're old friends, that we had coffee last Wednesday." A pause. "Sarah, who sent them?" She thought about Carver, the head of security with the closed book face. She thought about the file on Adrian that had apparently been compiled inside 6 hours. "I think you can guess," she said. A longer pause this time, the kind that contains a man recalibrating. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm not at the house." "Good." No hesitation. "Stay away from it tonight. Do you need somewhere to—" "I'm fine. I'm somewhere safe. I just needed you to know that this morning I received a call from a federal task force." She said it plainly, the way Helena had taught her to think about things, as information, with their full weight but without drama. "They want to meet tomorrow. They say Lucian is under active investigation." The silence on the other end had a specific quality, Adrian processing. She could hear it. "What kind of investigation?" he said. "Financial crimes. They said the situation is larger than the marriage agreement." She looked at the too warm wall across from the bed. "They said I may be categorized as materially connected to the activity under review." "Sarah." Just her name. "I know. You need to go to that meeting." "I know that too." She reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. "I just needed someone to talk to who isn't billing me by the hour or investigating my husband." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost." "I'm here," he said. "I know you are." She paused. "Don't meet with anyone else who comes to your office. Anyone who says they're doing a background check or a foundation matter or anything else, call me first." "Understood." She ended the call, lay back on the mediocre mattress with her shoes still on, stared at the ceiling. At some point she slept, which surprised her. The Fenner Building on Cascade was the kind of building that tried to be invisible. Mid-height, glass-fronted, the the kind of lobby you could walk through and immediately forget. She arrived at 8:45 and sat in the parking structure for 10 minutes, watching the entrance and the surrounding block with the calm, assessing attention she had apparently been developing for years without an outlet for it. And at 8:57, she went inside. Room 309 had a frosted glass panel beside the door with no text on it. She knocked once. The man who opened the door was maybe 45, medium height, the kind of unremarkably built that was probably intentional, wearing a jacket that fit well enough to not be memorable. He had the eyes of someone who had spent a long time watching people try to decide whether to trust him. Mrs. Veretti. He stepped back. Thank you for coming. There was a second person in the room, a woman, late 30s, seated at a table with a folder open in front of her and a recorder in the center of the table that was very deliberately visible. Serafina noted the visibility of the recorder. It was meant to reassure. She noted that too. I'm Agent Donovan, the man said. This is Agent Reyes. We're with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Task Force, federal jurisdiction. He placed a badge and credentials on the table. You're free to photograph these and verify them before we proceed. She photographed them. She texted the image to Helena Marsh, who had been briefed on this meeting at 7 this morning and whose instructions had been document everything, commit to nothing, and call me the moment you leave. All right, Serafina said and sat down. Donovan sat across from her. Reyes didn't move, just continued with whatever she was doing in the folder, which Serafina read as deliberate. One person active, one passive, creating an asymmetry designed to produce a specific kind of discomfort. She noted that too and set it aside. I want to be direct with you about what we're looking at, Donovan said. 3 years ago, our task force began tracking a series of financial movements through a network of holding companies incorporated in 4 different jurisdictions. The activity involved significant sums. We're talking north of $200 million across the full period, moving through entities that trace back, at their root, to the Veretti estate's financial structure. He said this simply, without emphasis. She kept her face even. The Bellavere Foundation, he continued, is one of approximately 11 entities we're currently examining. Several of the others are incorporated under names you may recognize from the agreement documents. The Alton Court property appears in our records as part of a larger asset sheltering mechanism. It was not merely a transfer for alliance purposes. She felt something shift in her chest, very slightly. What do you mean? We mean that the Alton Court property was transferred into a joint holding structure that forms part of a documented asset sheltering arrangement connected to funds we believe to be proceeds of criminal enterprise. Donovan's voice remained exactly level. The transfer of that property was not incidental to your marriage agreement. It was a functional component of a financial structure that your husband and his advisors built around assets they needed to place in what appeared to be legitimate joint holdings. Bursts. The room was very quiet. The recorder's light blinked red. You used me, she said. Not to Donovan, to no one in particular. To the room. The structure used you, Donovan said carefully. Whether your husband understood the full extent of what you would be exposed to, that's one of the questions we're still working to establish. She looked at the table. She was thinking about 6 years ago, the lawyer's office, the 2 hours with the document, Lucian across the table with the pen already in his hand, watching her. She was thinking about his one-word answer, yes, when she'd asked if he'd known about the Alton Court clause. He had known. He had known something. Whether he'd known all of it was the question she couldn't yet answer, and the fact that she couldn't answer it was the thing she needed to hold on to, because the alternative, say, the version where he'd known everything and married her anyway, specifically because her signature would help launder the architecture of a criminal financial network, was a thing she couldn't look at directly yet. What do you need from me? She said. Right now? Nothing. We're not asking you to cooperate formally at this stage. We're informing you of your situation so that you can make decisions in your own interest with an accurate picture. Donovan leaned forward slightly. But I want to be clear with you, Mrs. Veretti. If this investigation proceeds to indictment, and we believe it will, the individuals whose names appear on the documentation of those holding entities will face scrutiny. Your name appears on some of that documentation. She felt it then. The particular quality of a trap that has been around you for years and that you're only now able to see because someone has turned a light on. What are my options? She said. Talk to your attorney, Donovan said. a good independent one, which it sounds like you already have. Beyond that, I'll only say that cooperation with our investigation has historically been something our office considers relevant to questions of individual culpability. He sat back. We'll need a decision within 10 days about whether you want to engage formally. You can reach us through the contact on this card. He placed a card on the table without sliding it toward her, letting her take it if she chose. You're not under any obligation to do anything today. She looked at the card, took it. One question, she said. Go ahead. Does he know you're talking to me? Donovan and Reyes exchanged a look, brief, controlled, but she caught it. No, Donovan said, and we'd prefer it stayed that way. She stood, buttoned her coat. I'll be in touch through my attorney. She walked out of room 309, through the forgettable lobby, into the October air, and she stood on the pavement for 30 seconds, with her hand pressed flat against the cold concrete of the building's exterior wall, feeling the roughness of it against her palm, grounding herself in the physical fact of the surface because she needed something solid and she needed it right now. Then she walked to her car and she called Helena. Boyek. Helena listened without interruption for 11 minutes. When Serafina finished, Helena was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Come to my office, now." The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Serafina left, she had a preliminary legal strategy, a list of documents she needed to locate or photograph before Lucian had any reason to secure them further, and a clear understanding of the fact that she had approximately 48 hours before the equilibrium of the situation shifted, because federal task forces did not make courtesy calls without timelines behind them, and the moment Lucian's network registered movement in the task force's activity, he would know she had been contacted, and the 48 hours she had now would compress to something much shorter. She went back to the estate. She drove through the gates at 2 in the afternoon with her face composed and her hands steady on the wheel and her mind running a very quiet, very focused inventory of what she needed and where it was and in what order she had to move. Lucian was in his study, which she had counted on. He was on a call, which she had also counted on. Afternoons were his European correspondence window, and the calls ran long. She passed his door without pausing, continued to the east wing, went to her room, and began. She worked efficiently and without wasted motion. The notebook, already in her bag. The sealed envelope from Helena, already with Helena. The documents in the locked box. She photographed each one with her phone methodically, front and back, and texted the images to Helena's secure number. Her mother's letters, the ones she had never sent. She folded them into the interior pocket of her coat, her passport, her financial records, the secondary cell. She was almost done when she heard the call end. She heard his chair push back. She heard his footsteps. She was replacing the locked box in the back of the closet when he knocked on her door. 2 sharp raps. "Serafina." "One moment," she said. Her voice was level. She closed the closet, crossed the room, opened the door. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. His eyes moved to her coat. She was still wearing it, which registered for him. She could see it register. He was reading her the way she had spent 6 years learning to read him. Fast, precise, looking for the thing underneath the surface. "You didn't come home last night," he said. "I needed space to think." "Where did you go?" "A hotel." A pause. He studied her face. Carver said, "I know what Carver tracks," she said. "I assume you know I went to see Helena Marsh." He went still in the way that was not physical stillness, but something internal. The particular freeze of a man who has just had a variable shift outside the expected range. "That name isn't in your social network," he said. "No, she's my attorney." She held his gaze. "My own, not yours." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the estate continued its functioning. Kitchen sounds, the distant movement of staff. And around them, the house made its small structural noises, the sounds of something large and old and built to last. "We should talk," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should." She stepped back from the door to let him in. He entered and she closed it behind him, and they stood in her room, the room that had always been only hers, with its lamp-lit corner and its writing desk and its window looking out over the grounds she had walked for 6 years without choosing. And the air between them had the density of something that has been building for a long time and has finally run out of room. There are things about the estate structure that you may have encountered, he said. He was choosing his words with precision, which meant he already knew or suspected what she'd been doing, which meant the 48 hours she had thought she had were already contracting. Stop, she said. He stopped. I'm going to tell you what I know, she said. Because I'm done managing what you know and don't know about what I know. That's over. She held his gaze. The Alton Court property was not a routine transfer. It was part of a financial structure built around assets your organization needed to legitimize. My signature on your agreement gave those transfers a joint domestic holding status that made them harder to identify as what they actually are. You married me knowing that my name and my compliance would serve a purpose in that structure. The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically. A degree, maybe two, in the quality of his attention. The way a man's face changes when something he has been managing for a long time finally comes into the open. You need to be very careful, he said. Low, even, not threatening, which was almost worse than threatening. About what you're saying and where you heard it. I've already been very careful, she said. I've been careful my entire adult life. It didn't protect me from a document I wasn't adequately informed about, or a marriage built partly on the utility of my signature. She felt the cold anger in her chest, structural now, load-bearing. I'm done being careful for your benefit. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped close, not touching, not menacing, but present with a force of physical will that she had seen him use on other people and that she had spent 6 years telling herself was not directed at her. It was directed at her. It always had been. It was just that she had been useful enough that it had always been leashed. Whatever you think you know, he said, his voice very low, needs to stay inside this house. Or what? The question came out of her clean and direct, and she did not flinch away from it. He looked at her. The man who ran a financial empire, who had built his world on the principle that control prevented loss, who had never not known the next move, looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen in 6 years of watching his face across dinner tables and back seats, and the corridors of a house built for 2 that had only ever held 1. He didn't know what to do. I'm not your enemy, Lucian, she said. And she meant it, which was the complicated, terrible thing. She meant it entirely. But I am not your instrument either. I never was supposed to be. The people you've been talking to... He stopped, started again. You don't understand what you're putting yourself in the middle of. I'm already in the middle of it. That's the thing you have to understand. She stepped back, 1 step, deliberate, reclaiming the space between them. I've been in the middle of it since the day I signed your agreement. The difference is that now I know it. He turned away from her, went to the window, stood with his back to her the way he stood at the window in his study, looking at the grounds, the controlled landscape, everything exactly where he had placed it, except that she was here, behind him, not where he had placed her at all. You went to the task force, he said. Not a question. They came to me first, she said, the day after the gala. I've been careful about every step since then. A long pause. What did you tell them? He said. Nothing yet. She let that land. Let him hear the yet. My attorney advises that I have options. What those options look like depends on a conversation I need to have with you, one where you actually tell me the truth. She crossed her arms, not defensively, like someone deciding how much weight to carry and choosing deliberately. All of it. Not the version that protects the estate, the version that lets me make an informed decision about what to do next. He turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had stood invisible beside him for 6 years, who had learned his house and his rhythms and his preferences and his tells, who had developed in the shadow of him something quiet and precise, and apparently far more formidable than he had ever taken the time to recognize. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, still, the deliberate stillness of a man holding himself inside a boundary he was not certain he could maintain. If I tell you, he said, you become formally connected. Knowledge changes your legal position. My legal position is already compromised. Your attorney's office and your financial structure made sure of that 3 months into our marriage. Her voice didn't rise. I'd rather be compromised with information than compromised and blind. He looked at the floor. He looked at her. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had constructed very carefully to keep himself from ever having to stand at. "Sit down," he said, finally. She sat. He stayed standing because he was Lucian Veretti, and sitting felt too much like surrender. And even now, even here, with the thing finally cracking open between them, he could only give so. He stood at her window for a long time before he spoke, not performing the pause, not calculating it, or at least not only calculating it. He stood with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides, and the October evening pressing its dark against the glass, and she watched him the way she had learned to watch him, reading the set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the small signals in the body of a man who had spent his life making sure his body gave nothing away. He was giving something away now. She didn't know what to call it yet. "The Bellavere Foundation was established 11 years ago," he said. His voice was quiet. The voice he used when he was not performing authority, but simply speaking. She had heard it perhaps a dozen times in 6 years. Ostensibly for civic renewal, actually as a vehicle for moving capital from operations that couldn't be accounted for through standard channels. He paused. "That was not my design. It predated me. I inherited the structure when I took control of the estate's operations at 32. Is that?" She waited. She did not offer him absolution or condemnation. She just waited. "When I inherited it, I had 3 options." He turned from the window then, not all the way, a quarter turn, enough to speak to the room rather than the glass. Dismantle it, which would have required exposing the prior operations and everyone connected to them, including people I owed debts I couldn't ignore. Report it, which would have done the same. Or manage it, contain the exposure, wind down the active components gradually, and replace the structure with legitimate holdings over time. "You chose the third option," she said. "I chose the third option." He finally turned fully, looked at her. "I have been executing that wind down for 9 years. The Foundation's active financial movement has decreased by approximately 80% from its peak. The remaining 20% is complicated to address without triggering exactly the scrutiny that is now occurring." She absorbed this, held it at a distance, and looked at it carefully, the way Helena had taught her to look at documents. "And my name on the joint holdings." He breathed in through his nose, out. "Was intended to provide domestic legitimacy to assets that needed to appear as ordinary joint marital property." "Yes." He held her gaze when he said it. She gave him credit for that. "Not much, but some. The Alton Court property in particular was flagged by our legal structure as a high-value asset that could anchor the domestic holding network. So you married me for a property." "I married you for several reasons. That was one of them." He paused. "It was not the primary one." "Then what was?" He was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that needed time to become words. "Your family needed protection. That was real. The alliance was real. I was 35 and I needed a structure that looked domestic, stable. The profile of a man with a wife and an estate and a legitimate public presence is considerably less scrutinized than the alternative." He stopped, looked at the floor. You were someone I thought I could trust, who wouldn't ask questions." The words landed quietly. "Who wouldn't ask questions." She held them in her chest for a moment and felt their weight and then set them down. "You were wrong about that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was wrong about that." The room held the silence for a moment. Outside, the security light at the northeast corner made its rotation. Inside, the lamp in the corner cast its warm circle, and everything outside it was shadow. "The task force," she said. "How long have you known they were building a case?" 14 months. "And you didn't tell me." "There was nothing for you to do with the information." "There was everything for me to do with the information." Her voice didn't rise. It went the other direction, lower, more precise. "I could have protected myself. I could have made informed decisions about my legal exposure. I could have—" "Lucian." She stopped, let a breath go. "I have been walking around in the middle of a federal investigation for over a year without knowing it. My name is on documents. My signature legitimized transactions. And you decided there was nothing for me to do with that." He didn't answer because there was no answer. Not a real one. There was justification. He was full of justification. She could see it behind his eyes, the entire architecture of reasoning he'd built around every decision he'd ever made. But justification was not the same as an answer, and on some level, she thought, he knew that. I need to know one more thing, she said. Ask it. If I had never opened the agreement, if I had never called Helena, if I had never pushed any of this in any direction. She looked at him steadily. Would you have told me? Ever? The pause before he answered was 4 seconds long. She counted them. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. She recognized it as such, and it was not a comfort, exactly, but it was something, a unit of truth in a marriage that had been built largely from the absence of them. She nodded once, stood up from the chair. I'm going to cooperate with the task force, she said. My attorney will manage the terms. I will not provide information that directly incriminates you beyond what they already have documented, because that is not who I am, and because, frankly, the documentation they already have is sufficient to make my full cooperation on that front unnecessary. She crossed her arms. But I will cooperate fully with establishing my own position, my own lack of knowledge, and the circumstances under which my signature was obtained, and I will be providing Helena with a full account of this conversation. He was very still. That conversation is not recorded. No, but I have a very good memory. She picked up her bag. I'd suggest you contact your own attorneys tonight. Not the Veretti office. Independent counsel, the same way I have. Whatever wind down you've been managing for 9 years needs to move faster. She moved toward the door. Serafina. She stopped. Turned. He was standing in the center of her room, the room that had always been only hers, that he had entered maybe 4 times in 6 years. And he looked like what he was, a man who had controlled everything for so long that he had never developed the particular musculature needed for moments like this one. He was strong in every way that a certain kind of life required and undeveloped in every way that this moment required, and he was standing in the gap between those two things with something on his face she couldn't remember seeing. I am aware, he said slowly, that I have not... He stopped, rebuilt the sentence. The agreement, how I structured things, what I required from you and what I didn't give you in return. He stopped again. His jaw was working, not with anger, with something that had no practice being expressed. I'm aware that it wasn't right. She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had never stood in this room and said anything to her that didn't serve a purpose, at the man who had ordered her to be invisible and then been unable to stop watching when she wasn't. I know you're aware, she said. I need you to do something about it. She walked out. The next 10 days were the most focused of her life. She met with Donovan and Reyes twice more, both times with Helena present, both times with the recorder visible and running. She gave a comprehensive account of the circumstances of the marriage agreement, the nature of her representation at signing, her lack of knowledge regarding the financial structure of the joint holdings, and the specific conversation she had had with Lucien the night of their confrontation. Helena had reviewed the account before either meeting and trimmed it to what was legally necessary and personally defensible. Serafina delivered it with the precision of a woman who had spent years listening carefully in rooms where important things were said and learning how to hold information until it was needed. Donovan received it without expression. Reyes took notes. At the end of the second meeting, Donovan placed a document on the table. A limited cooperation agreement clearly drafted, which established Serafina's status as a cooperating witness with respect to her personal legal exposure and which specifically delineated the boundaries of her cooperation. Helena reviewed it for 40 minutes in the room. Serafina signed it. When she walked out of the Fenner building for the last time, the sky was doing something complicated. Clouds breaking apart in the west, the last of the afternoon sun coming through in long horizontal lines across the street. She stood on the pavement and watched it for a moment and breathed. She called Adrian from the car. It's done, she said. He exhaled. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly. Like I've put something down that I've been carrying for a long time, and my arms are very tired, but they're empty now. That's a start, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She moved out of the estate on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the gala. She took what was hers in the original sense, her clothes, the writing desk that had been a gift from her mother, The books she had ordered to the P.O. box over 6 years, the lamp from the corner, the river stone from her coat pocket, the cloth-covered notebook. She did not take the jewelry which had been chosen for her and which she had never worn as herself. She did not take the wardrobe that had been assembled by the stylist she'd never met. She did not tell Lucian she was going until the morning of. And then she told him by standing in his study doorway at 8 in the morning with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, not entering the room, just standing at its threshold. He was at his desk. He looked up. "Today," she said. He set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression that had been developing on his face for 3 weeks, since the night in her room, since the conversation that had finally been honest, since the thing between them had shifted from performance to something raw and less manageable. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the expression of a man sitting inside the consequences of his choices and finding that they are exactly what consequences are, real and costly and not negotiable. "Where will you go?" he said. "Alton Court." She paused. "Helena got a preliminary injunction on the dissolution clause pending the challenge. The house is mine to stay in while the legal matter resolves." He nodded. Once, the nod of a man who had already known this was coming and had prepared the gesture, if not the feeling. "I won't contest the injunction," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Your attorney called Helena yesterday." Something moved across his face. "I hired independent counsel," he said. "As you suggested." "I know that too," she breathed. "For what it's worth, and I understand if it's worth very little to you right now. The terms of my cooperation are bounded. I've told them what directly affects my own exposure. I'm not trying to bring down what you've been building. I'm just trying to not be buried under it." He looked at his desk, at his hands, flat on the surface, the hands of a man who had spent his life gripping things, and who was practicing, with visible effort, not gripping. "The wind down will accelerate," he said. "My counsel is managing the terms of a voluntary disclosure process. It's—" He stopped. "It's not nothing, what I've been trying to do. It's not everything I should have done, but it's not nothing." "I believe you," she said. He looked up. "I've spent 6 years watching you run this house and this estate and every relationship inside it," she said. "I know the difference between you performing something and you meaning it. Right now you mean it." She paused. "That doesn't change what happened, but it's not nothing to me either." He stood up from his desk, not coming toward her, just standing, rising to meet the moment with something more than a seated posture, some instinct toward dignity in a moment that called for it. "I didn't ask you anything," he said, "for 6 years. Anything about who you were, or what you wanted, or what you knew, or what you thought." His voice was very controlled, the way things are controlled when the alternative is falling apart. "I built a structure, and I put you inside it, and I called that a marriage." "Yes," she said. "That was wrong." "Yes," she said again. The same word, but different, not agreeing with a fact, receiving something. They looked at each other across the room, his room, the room where everything in the house was decided, where she had almost never been invited, where she had finally walked in and said the things that needed saying and had not been stopped. The room that would now be fully his again, in the house that would be fully his again, with its 12 staff and its manicured grounds and its silence that had always been, fundamentally, a silence of one person. "Take care of yourself," she said. She meant it. She turned and walked down the corridor and down the east stairs and through the entrance hall and past Dario, who held the door and said, "Safe travels, Mrs. Veretti," with the warmth of a man who had respected her for 6 years and had been careful about showing it. And she said, "Thank you, Dario. Look after him," and walked out into the Thursday morning. Alton Court looked exactly the way she had kept it in her memory, which she had not allowed herself to expect. The blue door, the garden, overgrown now in the way that gardens go when they've been maintained professionally rather than loved, technically tended, but missing the particular attention of someone who knew which plant went where and why. Her mother had known. Serafina stood at the gate for a moment and looked at it and felt the specific ache of a thing that is yours and damaged and salvageable, which she recognized because she had been feeling it about herself for 3 weeks. She unlocked the new lock, the one she had installed herself, the key on her own ring, and went inside. The house smelled like closed rooms and her mother's ghost, and something Serafina couldn't name. the indefinable scent of a place that had been waiting. She went through the ground floor and opened the windows, one by one, letting the October air in. She put her bag down in the kitchen, the room her mother had loved most, the room where the light came in from the east in the morning and landed on the old tile in a way that had always looked like something intentional. She filled the kettle, put it on. She stood at the kitchen window while it heated and looked at the garden, at the overgrown beds, at the lavender her mother had planted along the south wall that had somehow survived the professional maintenance and was still there, gray-green and scraggly and alive. She would fix the garden. That was the first thing. Not because it was the most important thing. The legal process would continue for months. Helena had been clear about that, and there were documents still to locate and decisions still to make, and a life still to rebuild from its component parts. All of that was real, and it was coming. But the garden was here now, and it needed attention that it hadn't been given, and she knew how to give it. And starting with something you know how to do is how you remember that you are capable. The kettle boiled. She made tea and held the cup in both hands and drank it standing at the window, watching the lavender move in the light wind coming through the open frame. The call from Lucian came 6 days after she moved in. She was in the garden, actually in it, kneeling in the south bed with gardening gloves her mother had left in the shed and a trowel in her hand, addressing the situation around the lavender roots with the focused attention of someone who has given themselves permission to care about something small. Her phone was on the stone wall beside her, and when it rang and she saw his name, she sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment and then picked up. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to let you know." His voice was the quiet one, the one without performance. The voluntary disclosure process began this morning. My counsel filed the preliminary documentation with the task force. Donovan's office will receive it by end of day. She pulled off one glove. "Okay. The exposure is significant, to me personally, to the estate's operations. It will be a difficult period." He paused. "I wanted you to know because it affects the joint holdings timeline, and Helena will likely receive formal notification in the next few days, but I didn't want you to hear it through the legal channel first." She looked at the lavender. "I appreciate that," she said. A pause. "How is the house?" She looked around her. The garden, the blue door visible from where she was kneeling, the east morning light just beginning to move across the south wall. "It needs work," she said. "I'm starting with the garden." Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that has something inside it that isn't finding its way to words. "The Belvedere Gala," he said finally. She waited. "That night, when He stopped. She could hear him finding the shape of what he was trying to say, which was new, which was not a thing she'd heard before from him. "When I watched you across the room, with Thiel, with Fenna, when you laughed." He stopped again. "I told myself it was irritation, that you disrupted the expected pattern, that I was noting an operational variable." "I know," she said. "I know that's what you told yourself." "It wasn't," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. It wasn't irritation." She held the phone against her ear and looked at the overgrown garden and breathed in the October air, which had wood smoke in it now from somewhere in the neighborhood, the smell of autumn in a place where people actually lived. "I know it wasn't," she said. The silence between them then was different from the silences of their marriage. All those strategic silences, those managed distances, the quiet that had been maintained like a structure to keep things from getting in. This was just two people on a phone, one in a garden with a trowel in her hand and one wherever he was, probably his study, probably standing at the window. And the distance between them was real and chosen and full of the specific weight of things that had happened and couldn't be undone. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back," he said. "I want you to know that. That's not what this is." "I know," she said. "I'm calling because—" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I spent 6 years in a house with someone, and I never once asked her what she wanted from her life. And I'm aware that calling once and saying, 'I know,' that isn't the same as having done differently, but I didn't want silence to be the last thing between us." She felt something move in her chest. Not the cold anger, which had been slowly, over the past weeks, metabolizing into something less structural and more livable. Something else. Something quieter. "It's not the last thing," she said. He was quiet. "Lucian." She shifted on her heels, found a more stable position. You have a very long and genuinely difficult road in front of you. The legal process, the disclosure, the estate's restructuring. All of it is going to demand more honesty from you than you've had to practice. She paused. I think you're capable of it. I've watched you operate under pressure for 6 years. You are one of the most disciplined people I've ever known. You just aimed it all in the wrong direction. She looked at the lavender, at the stubborn gray-green of it, still alive. Aim it differently. A breath on the other end. Just a breath, but present. Take care of yourself, he said. His voice, for just a moment, was something she hadn't heard from him before. Something ungoverned. Please. I will, she said. She ended the call. Set the phone back on the stone wall. Put her glove back on. She went back to work on the lavender roots, clearing the compacted soil around them with careful strokes of the trowel, giving them room to spread, the patient and practical work of someone helping something alive to stay that way. Helena called 3 weeks later to say the challenge to the dissolution clause had been accepted for review. The joint holding structure, the nature of her representation at signing, the conflict of interest in the original legal arrangement, all of it was sufficient to proceed. The timeline was 6 to 8 months. The outcome was not guaranteed, but the grounds were solid. Serafina thanked her and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table in Alton Court with a cup of tea and the morning light on the old tile, and thought about what 6 to 8 months looked like as a unit of time when you were building something rather than waiting something out. She opened the notebook to a blank page. She wrote, "What do I actually want?" She had written this before, months ago, the morning after the gala, in a room in a house that had never been hers. She had written 3 answers then, uncertain and raw. She looked at the page now and thought about those answers. To matter to someone, to choose something, to not apologize for existing in a room. She looked at the garden through the window, the south bed, the lavender, the east wall where she had cleared a section last week and found her mother's old rose cane still in the ground, brown and apparently dead, and when she'd scratched the bark, quietly green inside. She wrote, "I'm already doing this, not as a destination, as a present tense, as the thing that was happening right now, in this kitchen, in this house, with the blue door, with the notebook open and the tea going warm in her hands, and the ordinary morning doing what ordinary mornings do, arriving, unremarkable and unrepeatable, full of the small and sufficient material of a life that was finally being lived by the person it belonged to." She closed the notebook. She finished the tea. She put on her coat and her gloves, and she went outside into the late autumn morning, and she went back to the garden. And she worked until noon, and the lavender stood in its bed against the south wall and held on, the way things hold on when someone finally gives them the room and the attention and the honest care they needed all along. Quietly, without drama, without anyone having to order them to. They just grew.